What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, so you know what time it is. It's time to go over the top waiver ads at every position. We'll go over running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end. I will say right off the bat that this isn't the greatest week for finding studs off the waiver wire. Yes, there are some good players that could fill some holes in your roster, but I really don't think this week brings that home run hitter that you might be looking for. So it may be in your best interest to save up your fab or save your waiver priority. So for next week or the week after, when a better player that fits your team needs does become available, you'll be able to nab them off the waivers. Before we do get into the video though, we got to go over our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running backs led the league in percentage of team air yards in week 1. They were coming in at 12%. The correct answer was actually James White and Salvon Ahmed. Congratulations to Colin Grace 15 in default, the first to get this right on Twitter. And as for YouTube, Big Blue in 4X's. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which is which wide receiver through 2 weeks currently leads the league in receiving yardage. Once again, that's which wide receiver through 2 weeks currently leads the league in receiving yardage. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's hop right into the video. And we're going to begin with the running back position. I'll be up front with you guys. There really is no league winner at running back. Up at the top, we have Cordarelle Patterson. He is of the Atlanta Falcons, playing and splitting snaps with Mike Davis. In week 1 though, in PPR leagues, he scored 8.7 fantasy points, 7 touches on the ground in that one. Followed that up in week 2, another 7 touches on the ground. That's where he's not really making his heyday. He did have a combined 65 rushing yards between both contests, but where he's going to make most of his heyday is definitely going to be in the receiving game. He's more of a gadget style player. He's had 8 receptions across the 2 games, and in this most recent contest, he did score 2 touchdowns, and that's where most of his fantasy value came from. Me personally, I'm not interested in investing a waiver claim into him. I'm not interested in investing a waiver claim into any of these players, but if you do need to add a running back, if you need depth, I can understand adding them. Cordarelle Patterson would be up top the list. In second place though, we do have a handcuff running back, Tony Pollard. I could certainly understand people ranking him ahead of Cordarelle Patterson, maybe putting him atop their waiver claim list, and if you want to add a waiver claim to him, I can also understand that. He may not be available in every league, but in this last week's matchup, he had 13 rush attempts on the ground, compiled 109 rushing yards, that's right, eclipsed the century mark, even scored a rushing touchdown, and in the receiving game, caught all 3 of his targets for 31 yards, totaling 140 yards from scrimmage, even outpacing Ezekiel Elliott for the second straight week. If you were somebody to grab Tony Pollard off the waivers though, I just want to warn you that I wouldn't trust starting him as early as week 3. Nothing against the matchup, it is against the Philadelphia Eagles, which was in 2020 one of the tougher running back matchups, but in 2021 hasn't seemed as scary. Regardless though, I would feel more comfortable with having Tony Pollard ride the bench, only starting him if an injury were to occur to Ezekiel Elliott. Just because he posted starter level production in his first 2 weeks does not mean that it's guaranteed to continue. Moving into the third running back, the RB3, that's going to be Sony Michel of the LA Rams. As we know, Sony Michel was traded to the LA Rams as soon as Cam Akers did sustain a season-ending injury, leaving Darrell Henderson as the lead back. Well, at this point, Darrell Henderson, he also did get knocked out of last game with a questionable return, did not end up returning to the lineup, and as it stands today, we don't know exactly how much time he is expected to miss. Darrell Henderson could certainly start next game and not miss any time at all, but if Darrell Henderson does miss time, I think Sony Michel would be confidently the next man up. So this means Sony Michel would play a handcuff role, but with Darrell Henderson being more of a scat back, I would also expect that if both players are healthy, that being Darrell Henderson and Sony Michel can still get much more snaps than a typical handcuff would, because it would be more of a 1A, 1B type of approach. The only reason Sony Michel has not been able to get many carries up to this point is because he is a new addition to the team. He has been still learning the playbook, but as we get deeper into the season, and right now we're heading into the 3rd week of NFL contests, Sony Michel should find himself more confident and more comfortable in these matchups, and that's why we saw last week he did get 10 total carries. I would expect for him to have a similar type of workload in many matchups moving forward, even with Darrell Henderson healthy. The only question is how valuable will those 10 carries be, because we already know Sony Michel is a questionable talent. It's the reason the Patriots gave him up. It's the reason that across different running backs in the New England Patriots offense, Sony Michel always seemed to be a bit behind. Due to being more of a questionable talent, he ranks 3rd in this week's waiver ad list at the running back position. But moving into the 4th option, this is where I would say there would be a bit of a tier break, and we have Michael Carter of the New York Jets. When it comes to Michael Carter, he did have 11 rush attempts on the ground. Add into that 3 targets through the air. He caught 2 of them for 29 receiving yards. His 11 carries on the ground, he ran over 5 yards per clip against the New England Patriots offense, so pretty good efficiency there, can't really complain. The only reason why I mentioned it being a tier break is because the New York Jets offense is just really subpar, and any running back that is going to be starting behind that offense, they are going to always be limited when it comes to upside. Positive game scripts is simply something that you really can't rely on. Scoring plays, those are going to be few and far between. The New York Jets offense so far through 2 weeks, it has not looked very good, even though Zach Wilson does have a lot of promise for the future and potentially could change this team as the season progresses. From what we've seen from them in their first 2 weeks, albeit tough defensive matchups, they really haven't shown us anything to get excited about. Michael Carter did put in a solid performance in week 2, as I mentioned, very efficient with his 11 carries. He caught 2 of his 3 targets, but just due to the limitations in this offense, it's really hard to get excited about this player. If you need depth and you're desperate, I get it, add him. The running back position is thin, as it always is every year. Michael Carter putting in a performance, a double-digit performance in PPR leagues against the New England Patriots is quite impressive, but with him being stuck on the New York Jets offense and a difficult schedule overall moving forward, it's difficult to get excited about him. Another tier break, we have the next running back, JaMycal Hasty of the San Francisco 49ers. So far this season, it's been really difficult to pinpoint exactly how the running backs in the San Francisco 49ers offense are going to be used, but last week, JaMycal Hasty, a player who had a decent amount of snaps both in week 1 as well as week 2, he put in a really interesting week 2 performance, one in which he saw 5 targets, catching 4 of them for receptions, getting 5 carries on the ground, also being hyper efficient in that area as well, finishing with 7.6 yards per carry. Overall putting in a pretty productive fantasy day, one that came close to scoring double digits, 9.9. Looking back at his first week's matchup, he scored 8.8 fantasy points, showing off his versatility, scoring a touchdown in week 1, showing off his chops in the receiving game in week 2. It's really a running back who, out of all of them, has showed us to be used in all areas of the field, so that's very promising. But with the ambiguity overall going on with the running back position in San Francisco, it's really difficult to trust anybody. JaMycal Hasty, the reason we said there's a tier break is because we're not saying to add him with the expectation he's going to be the starter next week, but if you're looking for somebody involved, somebody you can throw into the lineup that has some guaranteed volume, JaMycal Hasty may be your guy, and with more and more players getting injured in the San Francisco 49ers backfield, that is going to open the door for more opportunities for JaMycal Hasty moving forward in this offense. The final running back we have in the waiver wire video is going to be Peyton Barber of the Las Vegas Raiders. I'd been fielding a ton of questions about Peyton Barber, whether to add him last week, and the reports that we received out of Las Vegas were that not only was Peyton Barber added to the roster, but he was also slated to be the starter, which was a bit head-scratching, but with any player projected to get a significant workload in any offense in the NFL, regardless of the upside that the offense brings, I think they should be owned in regular leagues because we're just not getting many running backs overall that are getting a significant workload week in and week out. So if they prove to do that, that is going to have enough value to be worth a roster spot. In week 2, Peyton Barber received 13 carries on the ground, a very poor yards per carry average coming in with 2.46. Those 13 carries only translated to 32 yards, but it was a difficult matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the better rush defenses. But if Josh Jacobs is going to be missing any more time, Peyton Barber is going to likely be in line for a high workload again, so that does deserve a roster spot, just with questionable upside due to his questionable talent. Like I mentioned though, he's last on this list, so the one I'm least excited to get on my roster if I'm looking for a running back. And just because they're on here does not mean you have to waste a waiver claim on them. This is just the order in which I would add them off the waivers. Alright guys, it's time to move into the wide receiver section of this video, and there are some interesting wide receivers that I think if they're available on your waivers, then I do believe not only should they be added, but some of these players you can start as early as week 3, and if you had started this first person, Sterling Shepard, in week 1 and week 2, you would have been very, very happy. In week 1, Sterling Shepard received 9 targets, catching 7 of them for 113 receiving yards, even scoring a receiving touchdown. That came out to 24.3 points in a PPR league. Looking at a PPR league against his divisional opponent, the Washington football team, he received 10 targets, so very close to the amount of targets he received in the first game, but still actually eclipsing them. He did catch 9 of them for a whopping 94 receiving yards, ultimately finishing the day with nearly 18 fantasy points, and through 2 weeks in PPR leagues, this is the wide receiver 9. We should not allow him to stay on the waivers, so if in any of your leagues Sterling Shepard is available, I think we've seen enough through these first 2 weeks to say that he is worth a high waiver claim. He is going to continue to be used in the New York Giants offense. I do suspect though that Kenny Golladay and the chemistry between him and Daniel Jones will improve as the season progresses, and that will be a detriment to Sterling Shepard, but I don't think ultimately that is going to be something that is going to just destroy his value. At worst, I think maybe it drops him down to a top 30 receiver as opposed to a top 12 one as he has performed through the first 2 weeks. Even being able to get a top 30 receiver off of waivers for the remainder of this season would still be worth a number 1 waiver claim in my opinion. Behind him, we have Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals. He's not going to be the only Cardinal that we have on this waiver list, but he is the only wide receiver. He received 5 targets in week 1, catching 4 of them for 68 receiving yards. I could get why people didn't want to add him off the waivers at that point, because this was a matchup against the Tennessee Titans, one of the weaker passing defensive teams, especially against defending opposing wide receivers. They allowed a ton of fantasy points to that position, so with Kyler Murray just popping off in that matchup, it left a lot of people wondering if that could continue and if Rondale Moore's 5 targets, 4 receptions, just over 10 fantasy points was worth rostering if it could continue, when he definitely didn't rank first or second on the team in targets, and teammates DeAndre Hopkins and Christian Kirk finished the game with 2 receiving touchdowns each. Fast forward though to week 2, even though this was another positive matchup when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers, Rondale Moore was a player who finished with 23.4 PPR fantasy points, coming in with 8 total targets, exceeding what he received in week 1. He caught 7 of them for 114 receiving yards, but even caught himself a receiving touchdown as well. As mentioned, that was over 20 fantasy points. That is enough to carry your fantasy team. And with Kyler Murray playing like a potential MVP candidate, absolutely no signs of slowing down, adding Rondale Moore is definitely something we want to do. They have another positive matchup next week before they get into a bit more difficult matchups against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So expect big things. Rondale Moore is definitely a player that will be in flex conversation for us. And if you want to add a player that you could put in as early as week 3, Rondale Moore can definitely be your guy. Coming in third, another great wide receiver option that you could start as early as next week is Tim Patrick of the Denver Broncos. As we know, Jerry Jeudy has been placed on IR and is slated to miss a significant amount of time, and while he is missing out of the offense, Tim Patrick is going to get a significantly higher workload. Through 2 weeks, he has already put together starter level production and looks to be a weapon in the red zone. Against New York Giants and Jacksonville, he scored a touchdown in each contest, and despite not being the team's leading receiver that will be going to Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, even playing second fiddle, that's going to be a valuable role for your fantasy roster. We definitely recommend adding Tim Patrick. He's a player that will be in flex conversation next week against another soft matchup against the New York Jets, so look to start him if you're desperate to fill your flex spot. Once again, this is another wide receiver you can find off the waivers that can start next week. The next wide receiver we have is Henry Ruggs of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's coming off of a phenomenal game where he clips the century mark, coming in with 113 receiving yards, even scoring a touchdown. He was a superior deep threat, showing off exactly why the Las Vegas Raiders invested a first-round pick into him. He received 7 targets, caught 5 of them, as mentioned, 113 yards and a touchdown. This team in offense definitely moves through Darren Waller, so don't think you're adding Henry Ruggs and you're getting the leading receiver on this team. But with him being a deep threat, volume is not always going to be a concern because he can perform with a mere 3 targets. We know he's a threat to score from any area of the field, and in those low target games, having an ability to score on such a low target market share is going to be an advantage that he has over other options on the waivers. To be frank, his upcoming schedule doesn't look all that bountiful. We have Miami to the LA Chargers, to the Chicago Bears, to the Denver Broncos. That's 4 straight matchups that aren't going to be plus matchups. Is that going to be a death sentence on his fantasy value? No, that's more thinking short term. And with his style of football, he's definitely the type of player that can win in a subpar matchup, so it shouldn't be a reason you completely avoid him. Just temper your expectations if you need a player to start this upcoming week. The final wide receiver we have is Zach Pascal of the Indianapolis Colts. He's coming off of 2 very fine performances against the Seattle Seahawks and the LA Rams. In week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks, he has scored over 20 fantasy points in a PPR league on a mere 5 targets, 4 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns though, and he followed that up in week 2 against a very difficult matchup against the LA Rams, one in which we wouldn't start any wide receivers against. He found a way to win though on a mere 6 targets, catching 5 of them for 38 yards, finding the end zone yet again. He now ranks as the wide receiver 17 on the season, and in week 3 draws a soft matchup against the Tennessee Titans, one that's very beatable, one that also has an offense that can score many points, so expect them to both challenge each other offensively. That's good for both of the offenses. For that reason, we definitely think he should be added off waivers. Owned in all leagues, is in flex consideration for week 3, so if he's available on your waiver wire, don't let it slip past you. Moving into the quarterbacks and tight ends, this is where I think the biggest value point is going to be in this week's waiver wire, because up at the top we have Justin Fields, who is easily the #1 ad in all of fantasy football off the waiver wire this week, over the running backs, over the wide receivers. Justin Fields, he's a mobile quarterback who definitely can be a top 12 quarterback for fantasy football for the remainder of the season. That's not to say that there may not be bumps in the road, but with him playing the entire second half in last week's contest, Justin Fields is well on his way to being a full-time starter. He gets a positive matchup against the Cleveland Browns, and although I may not start him in that one, I may want to see him develop a little bit more. We should have a lot of optimism for Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears offense. They have plenty of playmakers, enough playmakers for Justin Fields to get it done, and with him being a mobile quarterback, we could have a Jalen Hurts-like fantasy output where the rushing production is going to carry the floor and the passing is going to provide the upside. For that, Justin Fields, add him. It's not speculative anymore. He's going to be starting before you know it, and if you don't add him now, your opponents will, and you'll never have a shot at getting him in the future. Behind him, we have Teddy Bridgewater of the Denver Broncos. Adding Teddy Bridgewater is going to be for those teams that have just had subpar quarterback play in the first 2 weeks. You're looking for just a solid guy to rotate in, or potentially just be your starter in the short term as you find a solution for the position. That's exactly where I think Teddy Bridgewater is going to come into play, because he has played phenomenally through the first 2 weeks. He scored over 20 fantasy points in each contest. He currently ranks as the quarterback 14 in all of fantasy football. He draws an extremely soft matchup this upcoming week against the New York Jets, as mentioned earlier when talking about Tim Patrick. So if you're looking for a quarterback that you need to start as early as week 3, this is going to be your guy. I feel confident even pairing him with Tim Patrick. The output that you're going to get from both is going to be well worth the start. Then coming in as the third and final quarterback we have on this list is going to be Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. This has been a player, an afterthought for most people for this fantasy season, but he's really surprised us just from a fantasy perspective. No, he didn't win against the Washington football team last Thursday. His connection with new receiver Kenny Golladay is questionable at best, but that could also provide upside for the future. Imagine he does fire on all cylinders. Kenny Golladay, he's catching all the passes that are attempted his direction. Sterling Shepard continues to play out of his mind. Then in that case, there is plenty of upside for Daniel Jones in the future, who has been providing much more value with his legs, getting a lot of fantasy production in that area. Another factor that not only increases his floor, but adds to his week-to-week consistency. So Daniel Jones, the current quarterback 5 in all of fantasy football, is a player that you should all consider adding if you have any question marks at the quarterback position. The final ad we have off of waivers is a tight end. It's the only tight end that we have on this list. It's Maxx Williams of the Arizona Cardinals. Not much to say in this one. Kyler Murray's playing out of his mind, and any player on that roster has the potential to pop off in any given week. Maxx Williams does seem to be the receiving tight end for this team. In last week's contest, he received 7 targets, caught all 7 of them for 94 receiving yards, a phenomenal amount of volume for the tight end position. He scored over 16 fantasy points. Currently, he ranks as the tight end 14 in all of fantasy football, and for that, he should be owned not by a team that owns Darren Waller or TJ Hawkinson or even Mark Andrews, but by someone that just doesn't have a solution at the tight end position, maybe needs someone to rotate in. I think Maxx Williams, he can be a matchup-based starter when it comes to being in plus matchups. I think you can put him in, and he definitely can develop into a more consistent playmaker on this team as he begins to get more involved in the offense. This was a positive sign to see his involvement in week 2, and we would definitely like to see where it goes from here. But if you don't add him this week, you may not get an opportunity to, because the tight end position is as thin as it always is. But guys, that's going to do it for this waiver wire video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.